train levels. You see a lot of level biomes that people really appreciate. The forest, the jungle, the haunted castle, space station under attack by aliens, inside someone's brain, the works. However, I think that of the wide array of video game settings there are, the most underappreciated one is the train level. Train levels aren't in a lot of video games, but when you do see one, they often use the various trappings of the setting to their advantage. Let's talk about the train level that really opened my mind to how cool these kinds of settings could be at first. The sixth chapter of Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, 3 Days of Excess. This is easily my favorite chapter of any Paper Mario game because it's just so different compared to other, more action-oriented chapters. It's a great usage of the train setting in order to force characters to be in an enclosed space together for an extended period of time. You really get to bond with the characters who you have to bunk with here, and combat is rather sparse. I particularly like Pennington the Penguin, who forces you to do mundane tasks for him over the course of the game's run. It's a really cute way of making you go through the motions. Plus he's a penguin detective. That's the best kind of detective. The particular brand of level design where you have to just immerse yourself into a world in the terms of a common person just really speaks to me, and I think that a train level like this really works in the favor of that design philosophy. You have to get to know people in order to deliver things to the right people, and you learn all sorts of mini-stories from them, like about how the Bob-omb family on board is going through a lot of trouble with their marriage. The mom and dad Bob-omb are literally sleeping in separate beds, which is a sad but funny detail to include. The 3 days you spend with these people lead to you getting to understand them in ways you wouldn't if you weren't forced together in a small enclosed space. And of course, there's the mystery of the Smorgs. You never really know what the Smorgs are, but they're this aberrant and almost eldritch villain. They're a hive mind monster made up of a bunch of tiny purple smoky things with little yellow eyes. I love them. They're unsettling. The fact that you're stuck on a train with no escape from them further amplifies that. What are you gonna do? Jump out of a moving train? Trains are a great way of making a player feel trapped in a very natural way. My only major issue with 3 Days of Excess is the fact that there's an extended period of gameplay at Riverside Station, which is a place that is distinctly not on the train. It's a really uninteresting part of the chapter, and frankly, I think it could have been removed without too much being lost. At least it introduces the Smorgs a bit earlier than usual, so that's neat. I haven't played the Thousand Year Door in a really long time due to it being difficult to acquire, so my frame of analysis on the game is pretty limited. However, my memories of 3 Days of Excess are still quite sharp, and I think it's still the best chapter of the game. It being set on a train lets all of my favorite factors of it show through. The forced interactions between characters and getting to learn things you wouldn't have in a different context, and the cramped horror of the Smorgs would be unachievable in a setting that wasn't at least some kind of isolated area with living accommodations. But that's enough warm-up. Let's get into the levels that made me want to make this video. First off is the Phantom Train from Final Fantasy VI. I love Final Fantasy VI. It's one of my favorite games of all time, but the dungeon designs are incredibly forgettable. Most of the dungeons, save for the Magitech Research Facility, Zozo, Narsh, the Cultist Tower, and Kefka's Tower, are all different forms of caves. There is one other exception, though. There's the Phantom Train, which is a train that carries the undead to the afterlife. It's one of my favorite segments of the game, even if it doesn't mesh too well with what's going on in the overall plot. The Phantom Train comes at a time when one of your party members, Cyan Garamonde, has just had his entire family killed in front of him and his country totally destroyed. So, from an external plot perspective, it really only serves to give him one last chance to see his family again as they board the train to further his character. However, there's so much more to this dungeon than just Cyan's excellent character development. Don't worry, Cyan, I'll get to you someday, I promise. In many ways, the Phantom Train dungeon represents so much of what I love about Final Fantasy VI. There are so many tiny, missable, unique interactions in this one area that are so fun. Cyan gets mad at Sabin if he pulls a lever haphazardly because Cyan is afraid of machines, and that's charming. You can allow one of the ghosts that roams the train to join your party. Sabin just eats an entire feast in the meal car, and that freaks Cyan out. Uh, there's this weird swordsman named Siegfried who's supposedly really strong, but you beat him in one hit, and he runs away with some treasure that you never get. It's all so goofy. There's just so much stuff here that I like. This is my favorite way to be rewarded by a game for exploring, getting to see character interactions. My only real gripe with this is that Shadow and also the ghost that you can have join your party don't really interact in these due to the fact that the game didn't want to account for whether or not you had them in the party at this point. Even still, Shadow actually does play an interesting role in exploring the feeling of being trapped on a train that I described earlier. He can't leave your party while you're on the Phantom train because he's stuck there with you. Normally, Shadow will leave your party after a random number of battles due to him being an edgy lone wolf type, but here he doesn't. This detail, one that you probably won't notice unless it's pointed out to you since it's the absence of a detail technically, adds a lot to this feeling of being trapped once you fully understand it. Not even the guy who always leaves can leave. I also think that a train being the ferry to the afterlife just fits really well. Trains are very claustrophobic. You're trapped in them until they get to their stop. This is all in addition to it being one of the few unique dungeons in the game. I can't stress enough how much unique assets can carry an area. The assets here are never used unless they are specifically calling back to the Phantom train later in Cyan's dream. Again, we'll get to Cyan someday. The music here is really great. Most dungeons just use the Phantom Forest or Another World of Beasts, which is serviceable, I guess. They're both mysterious tracks. But whenever there's a unique song, it really elevates the experience. Here, the song played is aptly called The Phantom Train, and the train noises are integrated into this track, and that really makes the piece feel more spooky and ominous. Incorporating ambient sounds into your music will make it feel like you're hearing noises that you shouldn't. It makes it feel like you're really there in some capacity, and it's really jarring because you don't typically hear ambient sound in music. Also, the way the song ascends from just the ambient noise to suddenly a whole brass ensemble is incredibly suspenseful, and it feels like a very natural but stark transition. I couldn't really talk about the Phantom Train without mentioning that you literally fight the damn thing. Yeah, the boss of the Phantom Train area is the Phantom Train itself. By this point in the game, Sabin has probably learned the skill Suplex, which was later called Meteor Toss in the GBA translation. You can do one of the most iconic things in the Final Fantasy series here. You can suplex the train. Unfortunately, aside from this fun aside, the fight itself is pretty boring. This is another thing Final Fantasy VI severely lacks in interesting boss fights. However, just by having prior context to the boss itself, the encounter is still better than most of the fights in the game. There's a lot more tension going into the fight with the Phantom Train than there is for, say, the random guy in Zozo who you just meet there, who lies all the time. This is your chance off of a train that's literally barreling toward the afterlife. If I had one major critique of the Phantom Train as a part of the game's narrative, it would be that it doesn't really tie into anything else. The only other time it's mentioned is in Cyan's memories, within his dream dungeon. You'd think that the confirmation of the afterlife and nearly getting sent there would be a bigger point of discussion for the main characters, but it's never brought up ever in the game. I honestly don't care about this that much, but I do think it's a bit odd in a game as cohesive as Final Fantasy VI. The Phantom Train is one of my favorite RPG dungeons. It has cute character interactions, some interesting puzzles, and of course a bombastic finale boss fight against the dungeon itself, which is a really neat concept that wasn't really done justice. I appreciate the intent quite a bit though. Our next train level doesn't quite aim so high, but I think that it achieves what it set out to do just as well, if not even better. That train level is yet another 6th chapter in a video game. Eastward's 6th chapter, Once Upon a Time in Monkhollywood. Let's get the obvious praise out of the way. I love monkeys. I think they're awesome. I love seeing them everywhere. This chapter is about a train full of talking monkeys. That is really something special. Now, let's talk about the actual design of the level and the area's contributions to the overall story of the game, because I think it gets a lot of unnecessary flack. Once Upon a Time in Monkhollywood takes place directly after the chapter The Knight and the Princess, which is the part of the story where things are darkest for our heroes. Alva, a friend of the main characters Sam and John, is probably going to die, and her girlfriend Isabel kidnapped her and ran off with her in a last-ditch effort to try and extend her lifespan. It's really tense. There are a lot of moments of just walking around in silence. You get one lighthearted moment with the people of New Dam City, which you've helped out over the course of the past few hours of the game, who bid you farewell, sure, but after that you have to narrowly avoid being trapped in a time loop forever with your companions William and Daniel. It's not a fun time. But many people criticize the Once Upon a Time in Monkhollywood, a chapter where you're making movies with a bunch of monkeys on a train, comes right after it. However, I think that the fact it comes after it is actually genius. Not only does it give the audience a break from the darkness of the previous chapter and what's going to happen in the next 2 chapters, but it also plays to one of Eastward's greatest strengths, creating a world that feels lived in. Of course, the rest of the world doesn't really care about the struggles of the player. It doesn't center around you. It's its own world that has its own people with their own concerns. The world doesn't care if the light-hearted monkey train is thematically incoherent with the depressing events you just bore witness to. Eastward is a game all about absorbing you into this zany world, and to have it not care about what's going on in the plot is really emblematic of that. The train itself has the traditional Eastward design philosophy of creating a living, breathing community for you to engross yourself in. This time it just happens to be monkeys, which is mostly an improvement. While you don't get nearly the same amount of time with them as you do with, say, New Dam City, you still get enough time with them to form a connection. This makes use of the fact that you're on a train. Like 3 Days of Excess from earlier, the fact that you're forced onto a train with these characters means you're more likely to want to get to know them. It's a good natural reason for you to want to get to know the cast of NPCs. You're going to be stuck with them for a while, especially considering the whole time field thing. You learn about the weird time field around the train over the course of the chapter, which not only sets up later time shenanigans, but also allows for some really neat moments. Throughout the game, there's a game inside the game you've had the option to play called Earthborn, which is a pastiche of Dragon Quest. In that game, one of the characters is the Rocket Knight. Now, back in the main world of Eastward, the aforementioned character Isabel is often referred to as the Knight or the Rocket Knight. Well, as it turns out, the rocket that she used, which earned her this moniker, was what was used as a prop in the Earthborn movie, as the Monkhollywood civilization is decades and decades behind the one outside the time field. You even get to meet the monkey who starred in Earthborn as the monkey. It's a really interesting moment that starts to get you to have some questions about the true nature of Earthborn, questions that don't ever really get answered. And I think that's a really interesting facet of the game's world. There's this oddity of a video game lying around that doesn't abide by linear time. There's also the terrifying and haunting imagery of the harvesting factories. If you've seen my other video on Eastward, you know that these factories remind you of the guilt of the town that you accidentally killed early in the game. Over the course of the game, the 2 main characters have been evading this near inescapable force of death known as the miasma, which has killed several people in the wake of their travels, like the people of Greenberg, which I just mentioned. As it turns out, this train has one of the factories that produces the miasma, and Solomon, a weird dude who you see at various ages throughout the story for mysterious reasons, and probably the closest thing to a main villain in the story, decides to set the factory loose on the monkeys once you arrive. Now, the miasma disappointingly never actually shows up, But you don't know that as you play through the area, trying to get to Solomon and stop him. The feeling of being trapped on this train with this world-ending, existence-erasing threat in a time loop of all things is really, truly palpable here. It's an intense fight for your life to get to the factory and shut it off. Luckily, it was never really turned on, so you don't have to shut it off, but it's still nerve-wracking to try and get there. Of course, it's capped off with a brilliant boss fight. You fight a monkey train. That means it's amazing. It's a tiny train inside the train with monkey features. It's literally one of the greatest bosses in gaming just for being a monkey train. In all honesty, it's kind of an annoying fight. There's a lot of monkey heads that spawn and it goes on for a little long, which is a major criticism I have of a lot of Eastward's boss fights. They tend to drag. There's a fun quiz show game you do here which teaches you a lot more about the lore of the world and of the ideology of Solomon. You get the rocket and you leave the time field and never return to Monk Hollywood. Even though a lot of people regard this chapter as a waste of time, I think it's a really great breather area. You get to fight Solomon again, and you also get the feelings of being trapped that only a train level can really bring. Well, that and an abandoned space station, I guess, but you aren't really going to be seeing those outside of Metroid Fusion and Knights of the Old Republic 2. Also, come on, it's a train full of talking monkeys. How can you not love that? I think that train levels have a lot of potential to be interesting. There are so many great ones from the history of gaming, like the ones I just analyzed, or even the more simple ones like the Gunman Clive train level, which is just platforming on a train. It's just a fun time. I personally think it's a biome that doesn't get enough love. It creates a feeling of being trapped very well, and a really good natural explanation for bonding with a group of people. Sometimes it's even just full of monkeys. Sure, there's grass, desert, and water, but what about train? This has been Arcade Everlasting, hoping we get to see more levels on the railway. Signing off. Thank you for watching.